because today we're starting to read the body of the book, the first two chapters of it, I wanted to start by saying something about the overall structure of the book, because this is something that's been misunderstood for a long time and has led to people missing important things about it. These two chapters are part of the first three chapters that he calls consciousness. That's a division of the book at the same level as the next one, self-consciousness. And the next section is reason. After that is spirit. He seems to have changed his mind about the chaptering. The first three chapters correspond to divisions of the size that'll only be one chapter later on. And I think the beginning of wisdom in reading the book is to realize that the first three chapters are about different aspects of spirit. Consciousness is about our cognitive relation to the objective world, beginning with perceptual language entry transition in noninferential reports. It opens up the topic of our empirical knowledge of things. In self-consciousness, we look at the recognitive attitudes and the normative statuses that they institute, including the crucial status of being a normative subject in Kant's sense, somebody with the authority to bind themselves, to make themselves responsible. That's what the self-consciousness chapter is about. And then the reason chapter is about purposive agency, intentional agency. In section 22, in the preface that we haven't read, he says reason is purposive agency. And that's certainly the way, that certainly is the topic of that chapter. Spirit then, which is as long as everything that's come before, ties together all those aspects and just talks about us, who are empirical knowers, who are normative subjects, and who are practical doers. So if you look at that, here, I'll put it in the chat one more time. If you look at the handout on the structure of the phenomenology, you'll see him saying, telling us that these first three large sections of the book are about aspects of us: cognition, recognition, and agency, not about stages in our development. He says, quote, the moments of the whole, consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, and spirit, because their moments have no existence in separation from one another. Here, in that remark, I think he means by spirit the whole community, but in another sense, what they're all aspects of is spirit. And he goes on to say, their totality taken together, that is consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, constitutes spirit in its mundane existence generally. Within each aspect or moment, there is cumulative or historical development. The stages of consciousness, what he calls sense certainty, perception, and understanding, those sequentially develop out of each other. But there isn't sequential development between these large sections. The events that are discussed in self-consciousness don't in any sense happen after the ones in consciousness. The ones in reason are not later. For the first 100 years that people read this book, they assumed that was not so, and that we were looking at one unbroken historical development. It was embarrassing because in the Force and Understanding section, it seems like we're talking about Newtonian force, and yet that comes before the discussion of the Roman Empire in self-consciousness, for instance. So he says, we saw that each of these moments was differentiated again in its own self into a process of its own and assumed different shapes, as e.g. in consciousness, sense certainty, and perception were distinct from each other. These latter shapes fell apart in time and belong to a particular totality. They are developing. These, therefore, exhibit spirit in its individuality or actuality and are distinguished from one another in time, though in such a way that the later moment retains within it the preceding one. But the transitions from consciousness to self-consciousness and self-consciousness to reason aren't like that. Here, I think. I've drawn you a little picture. In this way, the arrangement of the shapes which have hitherto appeared differs from the way they appeared in their own order. That is, we've got a narrative order as well as a historical order. Thus, while the previous single series in its advance marked the retrogressive steps in it by nodes, Knoten, but continued itself again from them in a single line, it is now, as it were, broken at these nodes, at these universal moments, and falls apart into many lines, which gathered up into a single bundle at the same time combined symmetrically, so that similar differences in which each particular moment took shape within itself meet together. So it's important not to confuse the narrative order with the historical order. And here he's claiming that, I've drawn little lines inside each of the consciousness, self-consciousness, and reason, because he's indicating that there's some conceptual analogy between the first stage of consciousness, sense certainty, and the first stage of reason, which is observing reason. Embarrassingly, self-consciousness only has two parts, not three. He didn't manage the whole architectonic that he was aiming for here. But in the narrative order, the spirit section comes after each of these, and they're sequentially ordered. But we're to think about it by the time we get to spirit as him having rehearsed the stages of ever more sophisticated appreciation of cognition in consciousness, of normative selfhood in self-consciousness, and of practical agency in reason, which we then all tie together and consider as one item. So the best interpreters, Hippolyte, who is, I think, the most reliable, close to the ground reader in his Genesis and Structure of Hegel's Phenomenology, he was never fooled about this, and he fully appreciates this. But as I say, at least the first 100 years of German scholarship on this completely missed this point. The passages that I've given you here come from the religion chapter after spirit. So they're quite late in the book. I guess people had made up their mind about the structure of it before they sort of got to here and noticed it. Okay, so that doesn't mean that there's no interest to the way he handles the expository transitions. In particular, the way the lessons that we, the phenomenological consciousness, the readers of the Phenomenology, what we learn by the end of consciousness that makes it appropriate for us to turn our attention now to normative selfhood in self-consciousness, that's very important. And similarly, the considerations at the end of the self-consciousness chapter that lead us to take as our next topic, the next topic in our education, as opposed to the education of spirit itself to be reason, those are very important. But it's absolutely crucial to see that the character of those transitions is quite different from the character of the transitions within each of those three divisions. And if one tries to look for principles that will make sense of all the transitions in the phenomenology, one's on a fool's errand if one doesn't appreciate the substantial differences in kind that there are there. Anything anybody wants to say about that? Okay. Oh, okay. And because we're starting the discussion of the meat of the book, I wanted to say something once again introductory about what I'm going to be doing here, as opposed to what's going on in the other parts of the course, the things that you're reading or have available to read. I think that the biggest problem in reading Hegel has been that it's difficult to see the overall shape of his project, the questions that he's asking, rather than focusing on particular passages. So if you look at what, there are disputes in the literature about the reading of particularly puzzling passages, the inverted world section of the Force and Understanding chapter that we'll talk about next week, for instance, and very little debate about the overall project that he's engaged in and the philosophical questions he's asking. And that's particularly important here, as we look at the substantive work that he starts to do. So I am mostly going to talk about what lessons I think he's teaching us. With the wisdom of hindsight, what can we find going on here? What lessons are there to learn? And I'm mostly going to be, in effect, leaving it as an exercise to the reader to find Hegel saying this, find him making these points. Now, this would be completely irresponsible if that were all I had to say about it. Here's my reading. Now you do the work and find that it's a reading. But I have done that work. I go to some trouble in the long text in A Spirit of Trust to say which passages I'm talking about, where I'm reading things, to acknowledge where I've left things out. For instance, there's no discussion of the religion chapter. I don't talk about the observing reason first section of the reason chapter, and so on. They're not fitting into the narrative they're not advancing the narrative that I'm talking about. And again, in the Humboldt Lectures version of this story, I go to some more trouble to hook up with the text. But what I think is most important not to miss is the philosophical moves that Hegel is making, the distinctions he's making, what, in a slogan, we have to learn from him. We say parenthetically, this is a big week for me. The German translation of A Spirit of Trust finally was published. We're starting to get reviews. They've been kind so far. On this side of the Atlantic, one wag said, at last, you can't understand Brandom until you can read him in the original German. And now they say we could do that. But, what I want to talk about is the lessons that I think Hegel is teaching us here. And I'm going to present it in a way that does not present those lessons in a way that does not track at the level of chapter by chapter level, the triadic movements, the dialectic movements by which he tells his story. Every once in a while, refer to those, and as I say in the other texts, I do. But here in these sessions, I'm not going to. Remember the slogan of Harold Bloom that I mentioned in my first presentation: every strong reading is a rewriting. I'm going to be presenting these things the way I would tell the story that I have learned from Hegel about each of these things. And I want to do it today in two pieces corresponding to the two chapters, sense certainty and then perception. And for each of them, I have really 3 points that I want to make that I see Hegel is making. In his discussion of these shapes of consciousness, he's calling them. These are really shapes of self-consciousness because they're ways of understanding this aspect of our discursive activity. In consciousness, these are conceptions of empirical consciousness, conceptions of cognition. So they're all at the meta level, meta-conceptual, categorical level. But where Kant had thought the categories were the form of discursive activity, the form, there was just one form of them. Hegel thinks that our self-understanding advances, it changes, that the categorical structure of our understanding of our own discursive activity develops, that it goes through substantial phases. And exactly how we should describe what those phases are, the lines that line up when we lay consciousness alongside self-consciousness and reason. Sometimes he says, well, we're moving from thinking what things are in themselves to thinking what they are for consciousness, to thinking what they are in and for in themselves and for consciousness. Sometimes he'll use the slogans from the science of logic and say, well, we're looking at being, at appearance, and then at the concept. None of these, I think, are fully adequate. Each one of them is picking up on something. I'm going to organize things differently. I'm going to tell the story in a different way. The overall topic, I think, of consciousness, said, is empirical cognition, but the slogan that I picked for the section heading of this, of my discussion of this, is mediating the immediate. And I think that's worth keeping in mind. Mediation is the conceptual articulation of things standing in relations of material consequence and incompatibility. The immediate is the content that takes that form. We start with sense certainty, which is not, I think, a view any actual historical philosophers have ever held. It's something like the driving force of empiricism, but no actual empiricist was as naive as sense certainty is. But I think Hegel's excuse is he's talking about what the motivation is. And the thought here is empirical cognition works best and is truest when we do the least. The less that the knower does, the less room there is for mistake. And at the limit, it's the pure passive taking in of the sensory given, not conceptualizing it all, merely standing back and letting it all be, merely taking in the sensuous immediate as we're wired up to do, without classifying, abstracting, conceptualizing at all. And maybe that's not possible, but that's the ideal. Yeah, Sequoia, did you?
Yeah, I just had a question about that. You said that no actual philosopher has probably ever held this view, but what do you think about like someone's position like Harris's, who says that this is kind of when we start thinking about these things, this is the first entry point before becoming philosophers, right? Like the naive position.
It could be. I mean, he says this is the position of natural consciousness, and that's a sensible way to read it. I think it's probably not true that it's the view of natural consciousness. And in any case, as we, when we're wearing our hats as teachers of undergraduates, know, certainly by the time they get to us, they their sensibilities have been debauched by various fragments of dead philosophical systems, to the point that we have to spend a lot of time disabusing them of these remnants of Cartesianism, of cynicism, and so on. So anyway, I don't find that a very helpful lesson to be working from. I mean, the principle is who governs least governs best. If you want to know the way things are, just don't get in your own way. Don't you be changing what is coming in. And he thinks if we, the phenomenological consciousness, looking on over the shoulder at this phenomenal form of self-consciousness, of empirical self-consciousness, have to express the content the way sense certainty has it, it would best be with this, a simple demonstrative. But we're to imagine that as invoking a rich sensory content. And we'll see that as soon as he's trying to think about that content, he wants to express it in what Strawson, in his book, in his Kant book, in his Kant book, but already in Individuals, calls a feature placing language. It's raining. It's night, which is a sort of this such. And we'll see that the development from this to a this such to a this is such, Hegel thinks all that's implicit in that original this. The this turns out to be triangular, even if we're not to think of ourselves as applying the concept triangle to it. Look, this, I hope, if you've looked at the sense certainty, is just a reminder. He's actually pretty good at putting the scheme in place. I think it is important to realize that his characterizations of the content are meant to be the best we can do to specify the way this phenomenal consciousness is taking in its content, understanding itself as taking in the content. And that's using a feature placing language that has some presentation as its content. Now, what's going on here, I think, is Hegel is analyzing and dissecting Kant's notion of intuition, which is essentially, and not just accidentally, part of the dyad intuition concept. And Kant certainly is not a representative of sense certainty, insisting as he does that the minimal unit of awareness is judgmental in shape and essentially involves the application of concepts. Nonetheless, I think the principal lesson to learn from the sense certainty chapter is that Hegel has seen that Kant's orienting distinction between intuitions and concepts actually has three dimensions to it, which in some sense are being run together. They're not heedlessly being run together, because you can make a good argument that Kant is purposely lining these up. On the other hand, he also suffers from not keeping them, from not explicitly distinguishing them. And these are intuitions in Kant are passively acquired, whereas concepts are actively applied. The genus is representings for Kant, and intuitions are elicited, wrung from us by the exercise of responsive dispositions. So wired up the way we are, trained the way we are, you can't help but sort of see red when in the presence of some visibly red thing. So this is the receptivity spontaneity dimension, which is one sense of noninferential, sense in which when I look at the stop sign and say that sign is red, its looking red was not a voluntary act on my part. It wasn't a move I was making. It was something I found myself with. I was exercising a reliable differential responsive disposition to respond differentially to red things. And so the first aspect of intuitions, by contrast to concepts, is this passivity versus activity, receptivity versus spontaneity. And clearly, sense certainty is all in on its sensuous presentations being given to it. It's not a matter of how it takes things, but how it finds things. So this passivity is critical. Now, the other two dimensions are dimensions of the particularity of intuitions. Intuitions are representings of particulars. They're singular term-like, the way this is, as opposed to concepts which are general, invoke properties or relations, involve classification of particulars. They're predicate-like in that they invoke properties or universals, as opposed to objects or particulars. And the third dimension is that as representings, intuitions are unrepeatable. They're just the tokening that they are, the episode, the event that they are. In that regard, they're like token reflexive expressions, where each tokening may need to be semantically distinguished from any other tokening of that type. Again, the way this is, this as an expression has all three of these characters. It can be at least passively elicited. It can be used to pick out particulars. And it itself, to call it this, as opposed to saying Fred or red, each tokening of it might pick out a different thing. The representing itself is particular and unrepeatable, by contrast to, say, proper names, where other tokenings of them pick out the same thing. So I'm saying the three dimensions are receptivity versus spontaneity of episodes, of the occurrence of the representing, particularity versus generality of what's represented, and the unrepeatability versus repeatability of the representings. A way of thinking about that is, does the authority or the credibility, the normative status of the representing, does it go with each tokening or does it go with the type? This is the language of token reflexives is Hans Reichenbach's terminology. Talk about token credibility versus type credibility. That's the way Sellers talks about it. And here, though, as I say, there's every reason to believe that Kant purposely lined these things up. It's part of his theory, not just some failure to distinguish. In fact, all three of these dimensions are orthogonal to each other. They come apart. And it is at least scandalous in a minor key that Kant, who is so careful and so pointed in insisting that we distinguish between representations of relations and relations of representations, that's a big argumentative move for him, that those are not to be run together. The one having to do with the representings and the other with the representeds, yet does not systematically distinguish between the representings of particularity and the particularity of representings. Both of those are intuitions for him. And Hegel's going to split these apart and going to say look, we've got to keep separate sets of books on these three features of Kantian intuitions, all of which are features of minimal empirical sensuous knowings as construed under categories of sense certainty. Now, I said that these were orthogonal to one another. Being passively elicited rather than spontaneously done is basically having, if we think about linguistic expressions, which is the way Hegel comes at this, Sprache is the Dasein of Geist, corresponds to having observational uses, having some applications of the expression that are not the result of a product of inference, but are exercises of reliable differential responsive dispositions. And that's not at all restricted to singular terms. Predicates also have observational uses. I can say that's red or that's triangular, expressing a non-inferential report of what I see. So it's clear that the receptivity versus spontaneity need not line up with the particularity or generality of what's represented. Nor need it line up with the token reflexiveness or type constancy of the expression. I might, to be sure, express my non-inferential report using a demonstrative or an indexical tokening, but I need not. I might just say it's red, or I might non-inferentially recognize John and make a non-inferential report that used a non-token reflexive expression, being wrung from me as the exercise of RDRDs, reliable differential responsive dispositions, does not line up with the use of token reflexives or expressions that are not token reflexive. In the other direction, token reflexives are not all demonstratives or indexicals. Anaphoric dependence pronouns are also token reflexive. Tokenings of he or it are token reflexive as well, even though they're not passively elicited. I may use the pronoun as the result of an inference, but it's still its credibility, its authority goes with that tokening. It's semantically distinguished from the authority of other tokenings of the same type. And we can use token reflexives or non-token reflexive expressions, both for particulars and for properties. I can talk about this color as well as talking about this object. So actually, these three dimensions are orthogonal to one another. And now what I want to claim is that in the sense certainty section, we'll see Hegel picking these apart, distinguishing them He's got arguments directed to each of these elements in the sense certainty section. But let me pause at this point and ask for questions or comments about this threefold ambiguity, these three dimensions of the intuition concept distinction. Are there these three? Are we right to see them all as in play in Kantian intuition? Are they, in fact, orthogonal? Those are, I think, the three basic claims I've made so far. Yeah, James.
You mentioned a moment ago that Kant may have had reasons, or there might be some theoretical backdrop for Kant not distinguishing these orthogonal items. And it's true, isn't it, that one of those reasons in Kant is that if we suppose that our intuitions are available to us in the absence of concepts, such that we can't take responsibility for them, then they're being sort of just wrung from us, seems to be closely tied to their being to these other aspects that seem merely orthogonal in the absence of concepts. So if you don't have that backdrop, or if that is not your sort of dialectical target, then it might seem like the notions are completely independent. But that is the dialectical target for Kant, I would take it. Do you accept that, or?
Well, I accept that that's, I mean, yes, it is a crucial part of the backdrop for him that responsibility doesn't come in until we've applied the concept and thereby made a judgment. So it's, the judgment is the unit of responsibility, and that's the first place where that notion gets a grip. But before that, I'm not seeing, and so accepting that as part of the framework, I see red as well as Fido. When I say this, it can be either this color or this dog, the particular or the general. What I have observationally wrung from me can be awareness of the thing or of the property equally. Both of them are subjudgmental. So I take it you were saying, look, it is indeed, we were agreeing, a crucial part of the metaconceptual surround here, that we say responsibility doesn't come in until we're at the level of a judgment. Now, if we would want to talk about the contribution of something subjudgmental, but I'm not seeing the asymmetry between the passive deliverance of a thing to talk about, a particular, or of a thing to say about it, a universal.
I suppose I would have thought that Kant would be interested to deny that there is any such non-judgmental thing wrung from one. So I would have thought that the point of the claim about judgment is that there is no deliverance sufficient to license that me saying, for instance, red, that would count as an appropriate application of that concept. And if that's what you think, then it seems like there is a strong correlation between mere affective reliable responsive dispositions and particularity, because that's all you get in the intuition. Or at least that was what I meant by saying that the theoretical backdrop makes sense of the unity of those two ideas.
I think I'm not getting why you see an asymmetry there. If we agree that what can be wrung from me comes in judgment-sized chunks, but we're asking what functional contribution how might we functionally decompose the abilities exercised in doing that, I'm not seeing why particularity lines up with I mean, one division we could make is particularity of what's presented, but why line that up with the passive rather than the active, or with the unrepeatable rather than the repeatable?
It could be something I myself am not seeing, but the point would just be, when you have a concept involving judgment, you supposedly the Kantian denial is that you're dealing with something receptive anymore. That once you've reached that point, you're always already dealing with an actualization of spontaneity. So the point would be, insofar as there is any merely intuitive, responsive disposition, it simply is not one that can involve any generality at all. But that might not be the dialectical target in this particular passage in Hegel. I see that.
Well, and I agree that you're articulating sort of the view that I meant to be invoking when I say, look, it wasn't just that Kant sort of didn't think about this. He has a view according to which these things line up. It's just that it doesn't really get articulated in, as I say, for instance, the difference between, as the cardinal instance, the distinction between representations of particularity and particularity of representings, or of representations that, I think do come apart, and is maybe harder to see the rationale for identifying. I do think that this is one of the places where thinking about the use of the linguistic expressions has a clarifying effect. That if you're thinking about the mental episodes, it's maybe harder to separate these features. Okay, well then I think we can actually see three arguments in this uncertainty chapter that line up with his consideration of these three aspects of Kantian intuitions, these three dimensions, I should say. So Hegel's preferred terminology is not intuition and concept, but immediacy and mediation. But he wants to be explicit about these different dimensions, different senses in which something can be immediate rather than mediated. We saw this language was important in the introduction, in just the opening couple of paragraphs of the introduction, the critique of what I was calling two-stage representational models that has us having to relate to our representings in a different way immediately than our representings relate to the representeds. And so a fortiori different from the way in which we relate to the representeds, which is mediated by the representings. Here, if we just think about passivity, about representings that, given the way we're wired up and trained, are wrung from us by stimuli. Sellers finds it natural to call what's wrung from us non-inferential reports. Now, taking on board the Kantian lesson that these things are judgmental, judgment-shaped, but non-inferential in the sense that when I notice something red or notice my dog, my coming to have that perceptual judgment or acquiring that belief is not the result of a process of inference. It's distinguished from my, say, concluding from seeing the dog that somebody must have left the porch door open because the dog's supposed to be inside. But Sellers, in Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, has at the center of his polemic against givenness, wants to distinguish that sense of non-inferential in which a perceptual judgment can be non-inferential. It is not the product of a process of inference. And that's what we're at this point thinking of as mediation. The home language game of the notion of mediation is the middle term in a syllogism that lets you get from the major premise to the conclusion. Well, it ties together the premises and gets you to the conclusion. Sellers is concerned to distinguish that sense of non-inferential from non-inferential meaning not inferentially articulated, not standing in inferential relations to other such items, not depending for its content or contentfulness on inferential relations to other things. In the myth of the given, it's the idea that you could have a state of awareness that you can acquire non-inferentially, and which is intelligible as having the content that it does, apart from any inferential relations that it might stand in to other things. And Sellers is going to argue that to be a cognitively significant episode, whether interior or exterior linguistic, to be cognitively significant, cognitively contentful, is to stand in inferential relations to other such contents. For instance, to be suitable to serve as evidence for drawing conclusions. That is, standing in inferential relations as a premise from which you can draw conclusions. That's what it is for it to be potentially evidence or provide a reason. That's what it is for it to be contentful, he wants to say. So it makes sense to think of things as non-inferential if we mean non-inferential in their origin. But it doesn't make sense to think of things as non-inferential if we mean non-inferential in their content. That is, having the content that they do apart from the inferential relations they stand in. So Sellers' picture is that we have causal triggering of states, the taking up of positions, the acknowledgement of commitments, which are the state's positions and commitments they are because of the inferential relations they stand in to other possible states' positions and commitments that we could undertake. So the beginning of wisdom for Sellers in EPM is to distinguish these two senses of non-inferential, one having to do with the origin and the other having to do with the content. One with the act or episode and the other with the content. Well, Hegel's term for non-inferential is immediate. That contrasts with mediation, but he's making the same distinction. Something can be immediate in these two senses. One, that it was not arrived at, this state or episode was not arrived at inferentially, didn't have that kind of an origin. That's okay. There are things like that. But one mustn't assume from that it's intelligible to think of the content of that act or episode as being non-inferential in the sense of being what it is apart from its mediation, its inferential relations to other things. And we see Hegel arguing for this as he's thinking about the different contents that empirical self-consciousness, understanding itself according to the categories of sense certainty, can have commitments. Here he talks about using the rubric of certainty. I'm saying think about those as commitments, but the commitment that we would articulate the content of by saying it is day is different from the content that we would articulate by saying it is night. It's also different from the content we'd articulate by saying it's raining. But those are different in different senses of different, because the certainty that it's night vanishes, he says, in the certainty that it's day. Those are incompatible contents, whereas it could still be raining. Even though that's a different content we could have, the one doesn't vanish into the other. It doesn't push the other off the stage. This opens up the notion that the contents of these unrepeatable events, the seeing that it is day, involve the application of universals, involve repeatable characters, features, that the features that are placed by this feature language are repeatable features in a sense of universal, that different ones can be classified as sharing a feature or distinguished by a feature. Now, here in the chapter, I rehearse and consider what I call the bad argument, that though it's not my way to name names, I think many readers of Hegel have diminished themselves, both by attributing to Hegel and out of a laudable desire to make him look good, endorsed and said, "Oh, this is a good argument." And it is an available reading of what he says, to say, "Oh, look, the this," when I say it's the this, is itself a universal, because there's the this that is day, there's the this that is night. They're both thises. So this is really a universal that it's expressing. And I hope it's clear that that's a bad argument, that the fact that different tokenings of the same type can apply to different things doesn't mean that they're describing it as having some property or classifying it as falling under a universal. Yeah, Sequoia.
Yeah, could you maybe use this? This might be the right opportunity for me to ask this question. Can you go a little more into your fussy terminological note about the difference between the demonstratives and indexicals here? I wasn't quite clear exactly about what you were going on about.
Okay, good. I mean, I need to do this fussing at some point. So here's two things I'm fussier about than most people in the vicinity. And one is, it's not good enough to distinguish tokens from types. That's Peirce's distinction. Paradigm is, if I write two A's and an E on the blackboard, and you ask how many letters are there, well, it's three tokens, but only two types. But we actually have to worry about tokenings, acts of producing the token. If you think about somebody who's demonstrating with a sign with an arrow on it, and the sign says, "You are a sinner." He's going around the city streets pointing this at people to remind them each of us is a sinner. The semantics goes with each act of tokening. The sign's the same, even though somebody else could have a different sign of the same type. It's the tokening, the act of saying it, that is what matters. Token reflexive expressions in Reichenbach's terminology are ones that, as Sellers usefully unpacks it, semantically differ tokening by tokening. Their cotypicality, being tokenings of the same type, doesn't guarantee sameness of reference or of semantic content. So you have to look at the content that's expressed by each tokening of it. If they coincide, it's, as it were, accidental. There's no grammatical guarantee that they will. Whatever authority or credibility is associated with it goes with the tokening and can't be inherited grammatically anyway by any other tokening, just because it's of the same type. And the two classes of tokening reflexive expressions that people have most been concerned with are indexicals and demonstratives. The classic contemporary semantic treatment of indexicals is due to David Kaplan in the 70s, that distinguishes between content and character. Character is the type, but the content is, well, in one version, the content is the function that distinguishes the possible in each, that takes you from each possible world to whatever object you're talking about there. And an indexical is one where the character tells you you need to fill in this index in order to calculate the content. So for an indexical like I, you need to know who the speaker is. And then the content will be that individual, the speaker, and you follow that individual from world to world. If it's now or here, you need to know the time of utterance or the place of utterance. And while we're in the vicinity, let me mention that these are all pure indexicals. And there's a whole class of important derived indexicals, expressions like my mother's favorite color, which depends on I, but doesn't pick out the speaker, doesn't pick out a thing like that. My mother's favorite day of the year. Once you have one of these indexicals, you can use the expressive resources of the language to build many more indexical expressions than just the pure ones. Demonstratives, this and that, Kaplan says, and this I believe is still sort of the default view, are a special kind of indexical where the index is, well, a demonstration. I mean, that's the thought. So what you need to know when I say, no, I mean, this puppy, as we're looking at the litter, well, you need to know which one I'm pointing at. And the thought is that plays the same role with respect to demonstratives, that the indices, place of utterance, time of utterance, speaker of utterance, world at which we utter, Lewis arguing that actual is an indexical as well. But that's not right. And it's not right because the demonstration, which they appreciate, well, it isn't, of course, just pointing. It's whatever it is that makes that the salient object. Lewis, the most salient pig is grunting. Now, you may have picked at, this pig is grunting, most salient pig is grunting. He didn't have pointed at it in order to have made it the most salient one, to have demonstrated it in the terminology. But now if we ask, well, all right, for this notion of the demonstration, whatever it is that makes it salient, give me a theory of those. Give me a theory of demonstrations. And in fact, there isn't one, and there can't be one, because often you don't know what the task of interpreting the demonstrative is not separate from assigning a semantic value to the whole thing. There are two sides of one coin. You figure out what the most salient thing is, and that's the same as figuring out what the expression refers to. What distinguishes demonstrations from genuine indices is that we can say in advance of the speech act what the index is. We say, well, that's the time of utterance. That's the speaker. That's the world of utterance, or the place of utterance. And there isn't anything like that you can say for demonstratives. And in fact, we don't have a theory of demonstratives. I mean, they are like indexicals in some ways, but in many ways they are not. And one of the arguments of making it explicit is that people have overlooked, and this is a lesson I learned from the sense certainty section of the Phenomenology, inter alia, is that people have overlooked a crucial kind of token reflexive expression, namely anaphoric dependence and pronouns. And you're not going to understand demonstratives unless you understand the pronouns that are anaphorically dependent on them. And this is the third argument that Hegel makes. And this is perfectly clear. The earlier one, that he's not making the bad argument, but is in fact arguing that we've got what he calls sense universals, predicates that have observational uses in play. That's the observation that makes the transition to the perception chapter, which is addressed to sense universals, that is, observable predicates, observable properties. But what's perfectly clear is, he says, if we think about the cognitive significance, we're supposed to have learned something from this sensory episode. It's supposed to be an instance of knowledge. And yet, the now that is night is not the now that is day. It's vanished in the now that is day. If there's some knowing there, I've got to somehow be able to hold on to that bit of knowledge. If I'm going to, well, for instance, use it as a premise in my reasoning, if it's going to be cognitively significant and not merely an unrepeatable episode like the eddy in a stream, but which is not a cognitive episode, or until represented, not cognitively significant for me, I can say this and something impinges on my awareness, we think, but because of the token reflexiveness of that, it's gone now. I can't say this again and get the same thing. Suppose I saw the rabbit dash across the lawn. I say this, but it's gone now. I've got to be able to hold on to it, he says. I've got to be able to say something like, it was a rabbit, where the it is a pronoun that's anaphorically dependent on the original demonstrative or indexical, that lets it be taken up in a way that makes it cognitively accessible and usable. Deixis, demonstratives, and indexicality presuppose anaphora. This is the first place in the book that we see this notion of recollection. If it's to be cognitively significant, we've got to be able to hold on to it, he says. Recollect it, bring it back. We need something that stands in a relation to it that mediates that immediacy now in the sense of unrepeatability of the representing. If it's merely unrepeatable, it's cognitively insignificant. It's got to be initiating an anaphoric chain, something that will hold on to it so that we can make judgments about that thing. If it's even to be the sensory anchor of more complicated kinds of knowledge. Unrepeatable token reflexive representings, tokenings, can be cognitively significant only if they initiate anaphoric chains that, when we've fully learned this essential temporal historical dimension of cognitive discursive activity, will be recollective rationality. But this insight that he has, that it's turning something unrepeatable into something repeatable by initiating an anaphoric chain. You say, what was that? That Tashbaz said, it was a rabbit. You say, I don't think it was a rabbit. And we've got a chain that goes from that tokening this to my tokening it and to your tokening it, that gives us a topic to discuss. Or if I want to reason about the thing and wonder, was it a rabbit? Because it's gone. And certainly the this that picked up on it is gone. Now, it's really striking how much ahead of his time Hegel is in noticing this and worrying about it. Nobody worried about these token reflexive expressions till Frege. And even Russell and Wittgenstein after Frege, having read Frege's concern about them, they didn't talk about them at all. Wittgenstein of the Tractatus, not a thing for him. It is in the later work. Reichenbach introduces these token reflexives. Russell later comes to worry about it. But even the people who gave us our modern semantic understanding of these, Kaplan, David Lewis, Stolniker, they never worried about the anaphoric uptake of these things, which is really how you have to understand what indexicals and demonstratives have in common. They are anaphoric initiators. They start anaphoric chains. Other things can do that. Indefinite descriptions can. I saw a man on the street yesterday. The man was carrying a briefcase. The man is anaphorically dependent on a man that I said I saw, but that use of a man is not indexical and is not necessarily, though it might be, demonstrative. So Hegel pinpoints the necessity of, well, his phrase, holding on, the possibility of holding on to any unrepeatable representing, if and insofar as it's to be thought of as cognitively significant, for it to be intelligible, for it to be cognitively significant, and focuses us on the repeatable structures, in effect, the anaphoric chains that make it possible for their initiators to be cognitively significant. Now, this isn't something that he'll come back to until the reason chapter, when we're thinking about the relation between an intention and an action, where he's going to claim we should think of the intent. He's actually, I shouldn't say the intention, it's the purpose. He's distinguishing between purpose and the intention, but I'll ignore that right now. He's saying we have to understand the relation between what's done and the intention that initiates it as an anaphoric one. And it's by thinking about intentional agency that we will come to understand this anaphoric connection, and recollection will be the most sophisticated version of that. Hegel is arguing here that implicit in the categorical structure of sense certainty is the necessity of elements in sensory cognition that complement and contrast with the merely immediate along all three of these dimensions. That we need something that isn't non-inferentially wrenched from us. For instance, the conclusion that we use this as a reason for it to be cognitively significant, that we need to see a universal element, not just the particular, in order to see what the particular is delivering as cognitively contentful. And we need to see it as initiating a repeatability structure, as something that we can pick up. Here, we have to be able to pick up with a there, and the now with a then, and the this with an it, in order to see those as cognitive episodes. So, although he doesn't say this is what he's doing, the philosophical lessons I see here, the enterprise I see as taking Kant's notion of intuition under the rubric of immediacy and saying, well, this is important. He's going to continue to use immediacy and mediation as his categories, but he's going to say you can only understand the immediate in terms of these three dimensions of mediation of it. The mediation of it by its inferential articulation, removing it from, using it actively in something, it's standing in these inferential relations, and its element in a historical progression where something is made of it later on. So these are all important lessons. And as I say, in particular, the lesson about the distinction between non-inferentiality of origin and non-inferentiality of content, really before empiricism and the philosophy of mind, we were not straight on that. And I hate to tell you, but there's still people who are hazy on this point. And there's a huge literature in the philosophy of language on indexicals and demonstratives. There are like 5 of us who care about anaphora. There's nothing like the same literature. And almost all of the literature on anaphora is about quantificational anaphoric initiators, donkey sentences, and so on, which that's crucial. They set important criteria of adequacy, but people still see, particularly demonstratives, as sort of where the mind meets the world, the point of non-conceptual contact between the conceptual and the world, without thinking about picking up the demonstratives anaphorically, which is what really brings them into the conceptual realm. All the action is in the anaphora, not in the deixis. That's the claim. The owl of Minerva flies only at dusk. And then how do you hold on to these? What does it mean to hold on to it anaphorically? That's a question that's being raised here. So I see in this first chapter really fabulous philosophy going on that I'm not a bit surprised Hegel's contemporaries couldn't see in it. Much of the conceptual apparatus that I've invoked to articulate this is the product just of the last couple of decades of thinking independently about these topics. But most of it just went right by Hegel's readers, and did for most of the time people have been reading him. So, okay, I've done more to map what I've said onto what goes on in the text here. But I think particularly in this case, if you reread the sense certainty chapter now with these concepts, distinctions, and observations in mind, you'll see that this is what he's trying to convey with the language that he's got, and not separating the different lines of thought in the way I have done, but they're all there. That's the claim I want to make. Okay, a lot more of that mapping is actually done just in that other handout, the handout on sense certainty chapter that I gave you, which does not line up with the way I've told the story here, but has more passages and so on in it. Okay, I have that it's 2:55. Why don't we take 15 minutes and come back at 10 minutes after 3? Okay. Welcome back, everybody. So, Hegel takes over one of these lessons for the topic of the perception chapter. The principal thing he takes over is the idea that to be cognitively significant, the deliverances of sense must include at least the application of concepts in the sense of repeatable universals that stand to one another in relations of consequence and incompatibility. So the topic that it bequeaths to perception, the perception chapter, to the next form of empirical self-consciousness, empirical consciousness, understanding itself as perceiving, is what he calls sense universals, which are observable properties corresponding to predicates that have observational uses, that is, that can correctly be used not as the product of a process of inference, not just as a product of a process of inference, but responsively as an exercise of a reliable differential responsive disposition, passively elicited in that sense. So, and the lesson that we're going to learn in perception is that what's expressed by a feature placing language, what we used, the phenomenological consciousness, used to articulate the contents of that were the deliverances of sense as construed by sense certainty, that implicit already in the idea of a feature placing language like that is the full structure of particulars and universals, of objects and properties or relations, singular terms and predicates. In the book, I call this an Aristotelian structure, categorical structure, with a small a, because I take it that it is this world of objects with properties, of particulars exhibiting universals, that is the topic Aristotle aims to give us a theory of. It's sort of the pre-systematic presentation of our language that his theory of substances and essential and accidental properties and so on is a full-blown metaphysics of. But later people, say Locke, had other metaphysics offered for that same picture of a world of objects that exhibit properties and stand in relations to one another. And the key thing is, Hegel's going to argue that that structure is already implicit in the feature placing language. And all we have to do is make explicit what's implicit in it. And this is the very first such transition from one categorical structure to a more adequate conceptual, meta-conceptual structure in the book. It's a paradigm of it. And I think really is a paradigm in that if one understands how this one works, that's how they're all supposed to work. Not, remember, the transition from consciousness to self-consciousness or self-consciousness to reason, but the transitions within them are supposed, within the divisions, are supposed to be of this sort. So, if we can understand that, if we can understand this, we'll have a hold of something really important about Hegelian dialectic. It's not a word I find particularly helpful in thinking about him, but these are dialectical transitions. So, and along the way, we want an account of the use of concepts that have an observational use. That is, a use that's non-inferential in the only sense in which concept use can be non-inferential. That is, non-inferential in its origin, not in its contents. And just to look ahead a little bit, the third form of consciousness, the third set of categories for understanding empirical consciousness, understanding, that we'll read about for next week in the Forced Understanding chapter, its topic is theoretical concepts, the paradigm of which is Newtonian force, where we should understand, I take it Hegel does understand, theoretical concepts in the way Sellers taught us to do, as concepts that do not have observational uses. Sellers has argued that in order to have non-inferential uses, non-inferentiality of origin, concepts have to have inferential uses. They have to at least be able to serve as premises of inferences, even though they can be acquired not as the result of a process of inference. And it turns out you also have to be able to get to them inferentially. So from its being read, I can infer that it's a stop sign, or it's being read in octagonal, I can infer that. So even though I just saw that it was read in octagonal, I could use it as a premise in an inference, but I also could conclude that it was read, say, because I knew it was a stop sign, or somebody had told me that it was the same color as a fire engine or something like that. So all concepts have inferential uses. Some concepts also have non-inferential uses, that is, can be applied not as the result of a process of inference. And some concepts don't have non-inferential uses. Concepts like electron and Newtonian force, whose presence can only be inferred from accelerations. And so it's the form of understanding that looks to theoretical concepts and theoretical objects, laws of nature. That's our topic for next time. And he's going to claim that the intelligibility of that is implicit in observational uses of concepts, in the same sense in which the distinction between objects and properties is implicit in the feature placing use of expressions that we've already seen in sense certainty. So the next transition is moving from sense universals to pure, including those that are not sense universals in his category, in his terms. And here the key thing, the key beginning point that he takes himself to be entitled to from the discussion in sense certainty is that the contentfulness of the deliverances of sense depends, to begin with, on the fact that those contents can be different from one another. If they were all the same, there'd be no content there. But, and this is the key point, they can be different from one another in two different senses of different. They can be compatibly different, the way it is day and it is raining are. Those are different things, but it can be both day and raining. Or they can be incompatibly different, as day and night are, or raining and fine are, where the one vanishes in the other. He says the one commitment excludes the other commitment. That is, we find implicit already in the content that we would express with a feature placing observational language, differences among contents and differences among differences. Some contents are merely different from each other. And some of them are exclusively different. Ausschließend is the term. They rule each other out, like night and day, or it's raining and it's fine. In either case, we're to learn a holistic lesson that grasping the content depends essentially on situating it in a set of contents that differ from it in these two ways. So there's a holistic lesson to be learned about conceptual contents, even of immediate universals, that is, sense universals, sensuously immediate universals that we're still talking about. As a matter of fact, anything that stands to other contents in relations of exclusive difference, material incompatibility, will also stand to them in relations of material consequence. Being square has as a consequence being rectangular, in the sense that everything incompatible with being rectangular is incompatible with being square, but not vice versa. So if you've got material incompatibilities, you're going to get consequences for free. That, I think, is why Hegel can take determinate negation as his fundamental logical and metaphysical notion and get mediation in the sense of underwriting inferences from that. So the first step in his argument is we are confronted, as we take in these sensory contents, we find as part of those contents, not only that they stand in relations of difference from one another, but two kinds of difference, compatible and incompatible difference. And he's thinking of this as part of the empirical content that we get. I suppose that Locke and Hume would have accepted that, thinking of these exclusive differences as part of the relations of ideas that we had. Here's the second move. He says, that difference between two kinds of difference gives us a categorical difference. It tells us there's something that doesn't stand in those relations of difference, but rather serves as a unit of account for them. Because what's ruled out, Ausschließend, exclusive, what's ruled out is that it should be the same now that is night and that is day. The same here that is raining and fine. It's not ruled out that one now can be night and another now can be raining. Raining and night are merely different in that the same now can be night and raining. But we have to keep track of whether it is the same now, the same this, the same here, that exhibits these, or different ones, in order to tell the difference between compatible and incompatible features, as we'd still say. To be incompatible is to say, well, it can't be the very same now that is night and is day, but different nows, yeah, they could be. And that doesn't mean that those are merely compatible differences. No, the compatible ones are where the same noun can. So to distinguish compatible from incompatible differences, we have to have the idea of a bearer or a unit of account associated with these things. That's what makes the difference between merely different, compatibly different, and incompatibly different, is whether that same bearer or unit can have both of them. And it's only relative to that bearer that we can understand these different kinds of differences of content. So implicit in the difference between the two kinds of difference is a difference between the sense universals that can stand in those two kinds of relation of difference and something else. The something else is going to be particulars or objects, which plays a different role. Objects or particulars don't stand in those two kinds of difference from one another. They're not either compatibly or incompatibly different from one another. Their differences we're going to understand in terms of their properties. The objects are different if they have different properties. But that's different from the way properties are different from one another. So implicit in what we found already was implicit in the feature placing language, these two kinds of difference, two kinds of negation, mere difference and exclusive difference. Implicit in that is another kind of ontological item besides the features that can stand in these relations. And when we see that, the features have now been promoted to being properties. Because we see that to be the properties they are, they essentially have to be in relation to objects, the bearers or units of account for them. So on top of the semantic holism, the holism about contents that consists in seeing each content be the content it is in virtue of the relations of difference that it stands in to others, we see there's this categorical holism, structural holism between particulars and universals or properties, we can say now, not just features, because we can only make sense of the contents of those features in terms of there being bearers of them. What, when we were still insisting on the other kinds of immediacy for them, gets marked in our phenomenological rehearsal of them as the this, the now, the here, and so on. Now we can see that function was essential, that the feature placing, it is day, it is raining, really was this such as, with the this and the such playing different roles. That's implicit in the original content. So you can see this notion of moving to a more adequate categorical structure by unpacking what's implicit in the distinctions in the the distinctions that articulated the previous meta-conceptual categorical structure. This is a distinctively philosophical kind of thought, Hegel thinks, and he's going to give us enough examples of it to teach us to do it, ideally. So first move, the two kinds of difference. Second move, but making sense of those two kinds of difference requires acknowledging something that doesn't stand in those relations, two kinds of difference, namely bearers, units of account, we'll call them particulars or objects. But now, third move, there is something corresponding to those two kinds of difference of property in the category of particulars. There really are two different roles that particulars are playing and have to be able to play in this scheme. There's an exclusive role, what he's going to say, the object as one, and an inclusive role, the object as also. The exclusive one is repelling incompatible properties. The dog can't both be a Doberman and a pug, but this dog could be a Doberman and that dog could be a pug. But this dog can't have incompatible properties. That's what it is for it to be the bearer of the properties it is. Its role as exclusive is ruling out the properties it does have, ruling out the possession of others. Its rule is also is the salt as having compatible properties, being white and tart and cubical, as he says. It's a unit of account, and all of those go on the same account, which as an exclusive one, because they're all there in communion, he says, also white, also tart, also cubical, they exclude all the properties that are incompatible with any of them. But he wants to distinguish the role they're playing as a unit of account that is ruling out the possession of incompatible properties from their role as the unity, the medium, he says, of the compatible properties that they exhibit. And this is basically to say, so we can understand the role of particulars with respect to exclusive differences or mere differences. They're going to take some of the merely different properties and be a medium of unity for them, of identity for them. That's the also, but the objects, in addition, exclude all the incompatible properties. So although the objects don't themselves stand in relations of exclusive or mere difference, there is a reflection in them of that difference of universals. And this is two different roles that we can see them as playing. Yes, Sequoia, did you?
Yeah, I just want to know if this is for Hegel what allows us to distinguish between levels of categorization, between like subordinate and superordinate categorization for genus and species level. Is it these combinations of oneness and also that allow us to distinguish between, say, at one level a genus, at one level a species, and one like going up and down?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. I mean, what he's seeing here is that, what we're seeing here is that observable properties, well, that's all we're talking about so far, essentially come in compatible classes of incompatible universals, where the paradigm is shapes and colors. And it's the very same point that I was making about there being implicit in the notion of incompatible differences a notion of consequence. That consequence is what makes the property of being a mammal subordinate to the property of being a vertebrate, because everything incompatible with being a vertebrate is incompatible with being a mammal, but not vice versa. So all of this, he's going to say, is implicit in what sense certainty took to be just the deliverances of sense. And I can't resist saying, though, well, it's a challenge. I will put it as a challenge. That there's a hint of this argument in Hegel's text. I mean, he's reworking the material from Aristotle's prior analytics in which this argument appears. But here's the argument that is also a little bit dark in Aristotle, but that he does make, that I think puts the icing on this particular cake of recovering the small a Aristotelian categorical structure of objects and properties, or particulars and universals, from the less fine-grained feature placing one that's a sort of lagnape, an additional gift, that properties and objects differ from one another in that properties have opposites and objects don't. So the opposite of a property is a property that's had by all and only the objects that don't have the property. So from, if we look at colors, we have the exclusive difference of red from blue, from green, from yellow, and so on. Those are all incompatible properties for single colored objects. So if something is blue, then it's not red, it's not green, and so on. If it's triangular, it's not circular. But within whatever realm we pick, we can talk about the property that's true of all and only the things that don't have the property of being red, the non-red things. There's the property of being non-red. It's the opposite in the sense that it holds of all and only the objects that don't have the property it's the opposite of. So the opposite of an object would be another object that had all and only the properties that that object does not have. That's the parallel construction. But some object, like my left hand, has the property of not being identical to my right hand, but also the property of not being identical to Bach's second Brandenburg concerto. So the object that was the opposite of my left hand would have to have both those properties. It'd have to be identical to my right hand and to the second Brandenburg. But those are incompatible properties. It can't have those. In general, the properties incompatible with the properties that some object has are wildly incompatible with each other too. The thing that's red is not blue, but it's also not green. But blue and green are incompatible with each other, not just with red. So there's this basic metaphysical asymmetry between these two categories that we can understand ultimately in terms of the difference, the exclusive difference of properties, in that properties necessarily have opposites, and objects necessarily don't. So we learned something about this asymmetric categorical structure. And this fact that is rooted in the fact that it's never the case that all the properties incompatible with a given property are compatible with each other. That's why objects, it's incoherent to think of the opposite of objects. That's going to be a key point in the inverted world passage in Force and Understanding, which is one of the famously dark passages in this book that Gadamer, for instance, has written a very influential essay about, but so has, well, you're sort of obliged to write about this if you write about the phenomenology. Dieter Henrichs has a famous essay on it as well. So this will come back. Will come back for us. Okay, so I've been rehearsing a multi-stage unpacking and making explicit of what's implicit. Remember, for Hegel, what's implicit is what's an sich in itself, and what's explicit is what's for consciousness. We're unpacking for consciousness what is an sich already in the earlier set of meta-concepts, of categories, concepts for understanding empirical knowledge. First, we notice these two kinds of difference, exclusive and mere difference. That drives us to see two different categories that, besides the things that stand in those relations, the features, there must be bearers, units of account for them, or we can't distinguish compatible from incompatible differences. And then we see that those units of account, what we can now distinguish as particulars from universals, play two different roles, stand in two different relations to their universals, their role as excluding and their role as including. So there's an internal difference that's essential to the identity of this category. The difference between the thing as one and the thing as also. And then we can see that this induces a structural asymmetry between these categories, the particulars and the universals. The one has opposites. It's intelligible to talk about the opposite of the one. The other doesn't. All of these are instances of identity as consisting in difference. The identity of the features consists in its difference from others. The identity of these differences, the compatible and incompatible difference, consists in their relation to each other as different kinds of difference, which, when we unpack it, amounts to the difference between particulars and universals in this articulated way that it involves distinguishing two roles that the particulars are playing with respect to the universals as also and as one, and comes out at the end in this metaphysical asymmetry between particulars and universals, in that universals have opposites and particulars don't. Now, what I want to call, and I mean, I think this is a wonderful, sort of astonishing unpacking that he's done here. I find it a compelling line of thought. But I want to close by pointing out that there's really two orders of explanation here. And this could only become obvious in retrospect. But I think it's one of the things that makes Hegel an important thinker for us today. Contrast this order of metaphysical and semantic explanation. Hegel would say logical, and logical, semantic, metaphysical, those are all different ways of talking about the same thing. For him, semantic on the subjective side, metaphysical on the objective side, and logical as seeing those as two sides of one coin. Think about the extensional order of explanation, the Tarskian order of explanation. It starts with mere difference of objects. We start with a domain of objects, and they're each different from the other. That's why when we do model theory, we could just use numbers for them, because all we care about is the difference between them. And in terms of the mere difference of objects, we understand properties in the first instance as sets of the objects, the extensions that are the extensions of the property. So in model theory, with respect to any relational structure, any model, we have a domain of merely different objects, and each property is thought of as a set of those merely different objects. So far, those properties are merely different. They could be, however, complementary. We could have properties that in a particular model, one of them held one set of objects, and the other was the complement, the opposite of that, or at any rate, held of a disjoint set of objects. So the ones that were blue are different from the objects that are red. And if we now extend that and say, well, we're going to enforce that in all the models. So our interpretation of blue and of red de jure have to be disjoint. Okay, then we can say, well, that's our representation of them being contraries, of its being not a contingent fact that there's no round square, but of a necessary fact that being circular and being circular and triangular. Square is a bad example because the adjective and the noun are the same, but circular and triangular are exclusively different in that we're going to enforce in every model that they have disjoint extensions. And that's the line of thought that, when fully developed, gets us to possible world semantics. Roughly, we always treated negation that way. That is, enforced the complementary character of having the property and the negation of the property across all the models. Well, if we do that for all the exclusive differences, all the contrarieties, you pretty much get the possible worlds extension of Tarskian model theory. So start with mere differences of objects, understand properties in terms of their extensions, the sets of objects that they determine, and then look at functions across models of these things, imposing restrictions on those in order to get the modal oomph of them. Hegel's order of explanation is exactly the converse of that. But if I just asked you what is the exact converse of that Tarskian extensionalist order of explanation, I'll bet you would have been hard-pressed to say. But here we can see it. You start with exclusive differences of properties. instead of mere differences of objects. That builds modality in at the base, instead of that coming only at the very end as a sort of optional, additional add-on. You don't have the modality in the Tarskian model theory. You do if you enforce these restrictions. Think of them as possible worlds, but only at the end of the story in the Tarskian extensionalist one. Here, it's built in at the ground floor. We start with exclusive difference of properties instead of mere difference of objects. And where the extensional then understands properties in terms of objects, sets of merely different objects, in the Hegelian order of explanation, you understand objects in terms of properties as units of account for this difference between two kinds of difference of properties, the modally robust exclusive ausschließend difference and the mere difference. And then distinguish the roles of objects as excluding and including as the one and the also. And in terms of that, we can tell a story about mere collections of objects, what it is for the objects to be merely different. That's for them to have different sets of compatible properties. They're also the ones they include, as long as the ones they include are merely different. There's object A is different from object B if they have two properties that are merely different. That's Leibniz's law. So in the Hegelian story, we construct merely different objects at the end of the story. Well, Hegel thinks through everything using this logical order of explanation, which is the converse of the Tarskian extensionalist one on which our philosophical world is built. We've spent the last 100 years working out this and exploiting the Tarskian extensionalist order of explanation. And we can do a lot of things with it, even though it wasn't till the late 60s that we came around to worrying about modality, which now seems like, well, that was really important. How did we get along without that all this time? Well, by not paying attention to Kant is one way we got there. But we finally came around to doing that, and we can do a lot of work with that. But Hegel, in 1806, was saying, don't think about it that way. Adopt this contrary order of explanation. And the account that I'll give next week of the inverted world makes this the point of that. He's explicitly contrasting these orders of explanation. But one of the reasons, I think, an overarching reason that I think we need Hegel as a partner in our contemporary philosophical conversations is that he went as far as he could with working out this alternative order of metaphysical, logical, and semantic explanation. We've got much more demanding criteria of adequacy now for an account of all this stuff. But we need to know can we make better sense of from his point of view than from the other, or what advantages can we get from binocular vision, from telling a story in the Tarskian extensionalist mode and telling it in the Hegelian modality first mode. But at least we should be working out, in parallel, stories within the two frameworks. And one of the things to speculate about is if people starting in 1807, when the book came out, had seen this contrast, if this contrast had been in play when the Hegelian tradition in the person of Bradley and Royce was confronted with the extensionalist tradition downstream from Boole, and insofar as it can be pinned on Frege, but certainly on Russell, if we'd explicitly been keeping two sets of books on things, how different would the contemporary philosophical scene look? But here we are. We've worked the one out in exquisite detail. What would it look like to work the other out in that corresponding detail? Well, I try and do some of that in the book, try and think things through this way. But it seems to me it's sort of on the face of the story in this second chapter of the Phenomenology that Hegel is pursuing this other order of explanation, which, as a matter of fact, is exactly turning the Tarskian extensionalist one on its head, without which, to come back to where I started, you wouldn't necessarily know what turning the Tarskian extensionalist one on its head consisted in, except it's already been done, at least in general. So I think there's a lot going on in these first two chapters, and I hope you have some sympathy with Hegel trying to do things so differently and having only the inherited language, philosophical language to work with. Well, that's one of the reasons he's not just conceptually so difficult, but just linguistically so difficult, was he really had to make up the language in which these things could be said. And they can more or less be said, but one of the reasons we might think we could do better is precisely that we've been so far down this other explanatory road in the intervening years. So, okay, those are eyes to look back at the sense certainty chapter with. This story about the two orders of explanation, in particular with some chit chat about Leibniz's law and the fraught issue of modally contingent identities, I do in my chapter on the perception thing, and which I think there's a particularly easily digested form of it in the lecture on this material that I gave at Edinburgh, which is linked on the website. I think that one's a little better than the Humboldt lecture version of it. Okay, well, Force and Understanding for next time. That's two chapters of A Spirit of Trust, because there's just so much going on in what is then the final form, well, the final forms of empirical consciousness. So I will see you next time.